In this demo, we will look into how we can safely store the connection string and thus other sensitive configuration data. It might be tempting to say, well, the connection string is configuration data and we've got an app settings file, so we might as well store it in there. But that could be a bad idea. As long as you're working on your local machine in a development environment, you'll be okay. But once you're deploying to production, you'll be providing a connection string to a database. In our case, we didn't use a username and password to access our database or integrated security, but in a real-life scenario, more often than not, that is the case. Sometimes a connection string contains a username and password combination or the actual server name. Storing sensitive data like that in plain text configuration files is a bad idea. Just imagine accidentally submitting it to a source control system like Git or TFS. We do not want to expose that kind of information. Not a username and password, but also not the name of our actual production database server. So here's what we're going to do. First of all, we're going to get rid of the hard-coded connection string by adding it to appsettings.development.json. That's what we'll use as default. But for the production environment, we will use an environment variable to store this data. Let's start by adding the connection string to the app settings file used during development. We can then get the value via the configuration object. In the program class, that configuration object can be accessed via the builder. So, we pass through builder.configuration and the key to our connection string. That should already take care of the hard-coded connection string in development. Let's give this a try. I'm going to put a breakpoint on addDB context so we can have a look. We've hit the breakpoint. If we look at the providers object on the configuration object, we see there's 5 different providers. One is the in-memory provider. Up next is a chained configuration provider. This serves as a chain of the 4 others. It's this one that's responsible for getting the correct value from the right configuration source when we pass a key through via the configuration object in code. Then we find a JSON configuration provider for appsettings.json. In our case, that doesn't contain a connection string. After that, we find appsettings.development.json. That's our development environment file. This was loaded because we are in a development environment. As you can see, appsettings.production.json hasn't been loaded because we're not in a production environment. In our case, this file is where the connection string should come from. And lastly, environment variables are automatically added as an option as well. We'll get to that. We can quickly check whether the connection string will actually come from appsettings.development.json. We can use the immediate window for that. So we simply write out the connection string, and that is indeed the value that's coming from appsettings.development.json. So far, so good. Let's switch to the production environment and give this another try. So we open the project properties, navigate to the debug tab, open the debug launch profiles UI, and switch the environment variable to production. Alright, let's give this another try. We again hit our breakpoint. If we look at the providers, we now find an appsettings.production.json provider and no longer an appsettings.development.json provider. And let's try getting that connection string again. And this time it isn't found. Makes sense because there is no connection string in our appsettings.production.json file. We also don't want it there because we want to use a safer location for that. One possible safer location is an environment variable. A configuration source for that was already set up, as we've seen when we looked at the configuration providers that were loaded. There are other safe locations, like Azure Key Vault, but that would lead us too far for this course. An environment variable is a variable whose value is set outside of the program, typically through functionality built into the operating system. In other words, if you use the operating system functionality for that, they are never stored in a source control system. Let's assume for a moment that my machine is the production server. On each machine, a set of environment variables is defined. We can get to them by searching for edit the system environment variables. On this window, in the lower right corner, we can now click Environment Variables. The top list are environment variables tied to my user account. The bottom list are tied to the system. Let's add a new system environment variable for our connection string. As variable name, we pass through the key, and the value is an actual connection string. This, of course, won't work. The connection string isn't real. What's important for us to see is whether the connection string will effectively come from the environment variable. Let's click OK. Let me remove these quotation marks. That's better. Let's click OK. And let's click OK here and here as well. For this to work, we do need to restart Visual Studio, as Visual Studio loads the environment variables on start. Obviously, on a real production server, this isn't an issue. So let me restart Visual Studio. There we go. Let's give this another try. We hit our breakpoint. And there we go. That's the configuration string coming from the environment variable. Important to know, as environment variables in our case override all the other configuration sources, this connection string will be used regardless of the environment we choose in Visual Studio. So to be able to continue developing, I'll remove it again and we'll restart Visual Studio again. Like that, we can still work with our development connection string. We can also get rid of this breakpoint. Now, truth be told, there still is a possible risk. And well, isn't there always? Environment variables are typically unencrypted key value pairs. In other words, if someone gains access to the machine or process, he or she can read out that data. But the approach we took here is already safer than using plain text files for production secrets. A key vault like Azure Key Vault is an even better option. And with that, we now know what Entity Framework Core is, its most important concepts and how to use those. In the next module, we'll incorporate this in our controllers. But first, time for the module summary.